and welcome to the latest edition of Paul Waltz Talks Advocacy and Influence. And I am delighted this morning to be meeting Carmen Bell, Managing Director of APCO Worldwide. Carmen, thanks for joining us today. Maybe you could start by telling us briefly a bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Paul. So indeed, I'm Managing Director here at APCO. APCO has about 30 markets offices in 30 markets across the world. And in Europe in particular, I'm heading up the Brussels office, but we also have offices, of course, in Germany, France, Italy. We have an office in London, our headquarters over there in DC. So it's really an international environment that I'm very proud to be a part of and really excited to be working in this capacity. About myself, I came to Brussels about 16 years ago. So as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm American, but I'm married to a Belgian. I have a Belgian family and Belgo-American kids. So kind of crossing that transatlantic divide. And in a prior life, I was an attorney back in the US. So I shifted from law to now European public affairs and communications. And yeah, so really excited to talk to you today about some of the stuff that we are doing, what we're seeing in Brussels, but also beyond.
What do you think businesses most often misunderstand about EU policymaking?
I think I can say definitely that quick wins are the way to achieve what they want to get. This EU policymaking, as many of us know, it's a long game, and you can't put a win or monetary value on it. Many things shape legislation. So you have different audiences, you have elections, as we've seen a lot in recent years. You have changing administrations, you have geopolitics. Look at where we are with the EU and the US relationship today. Trump's election alone has really required the EU to shift gears and place a higher emphasis in areas such as competitiveness, reassess its targets for climate action, even kind of the way that it's been tackling the digital platform industry because of fear of retaliation from the US. And that's very different from the previous administration. And trade partners like China and India, now they're also having to start to look to these other markets in light of Trump's actions in the White House. So EU policymaking is not so straightforward, and it's always evolving, and any strategy that someone will develop needs to evolve with it and to adapt to these changing circumstances.
Okay, but you can understand the perspective of businesses because most, if not all, of an executive's decisions will be made through the lens of return on investment. Now, if associations or agencies are not able to offer up in the initial stages of a collaboration some type of concrete results, how can a business person know that they're not being taken advantage of and they are actually getting some value for their investment?
I mean, that's a good question. And I think what's important is, for in most cases, what is a business ultimately trying to do? You're trying to protect your license to operate in Europe. If we're talking about EU policymaking, trying to make sure that your business can thrive, in many cases that your business can grow and expand as well. If you're a European business, you want to make sure you have a good piece of the market and that it's not being dominated by outside players. If you're a non-EU business, you want to make sure that you're accepted into that market and that you're able to trade or offer your services with Europe. And that's something that obviously is very sensitive at this time. So I would kind of look at it at three ways. What would be the best way to make sure that you have a solid strategy and you won't be taken advantage of? One is kind of just making sure that you can maximize your license to operate in an increasingly burdensome European market. So look at what you're doing and make sure it's more quality than quantity. Just, pushing out a narrative and message in various outlets without any kind of qualitative strategy behind it will make you sound like more noise than something that policymakers should be listening to. Two, get the information you need to respond more rapidly to the changing environment. For example, to navigate an enormous flow of information coming out of the EU, coming out of the Commission, coming out of the Parliament. Get the support you need. That's something I have to say somebody like APCO can do, but also just making sure that you know what's important to pay attention to and what you should be addressing. And this will enhance the decision-making capacity of your business. What
do you mean by getting the support you need?
So if you need certain tools, if you need a subscription, if you need a team on the ground to help talk to people, to gain intel, Brussels is an intel-heavy city. the best pieces of information, they don't come out on the news. They come in those coffees, whether it's at the parliament, whether it's in the little coffee bars in Brussels. Network, and find the people that you need to talk to. Journalists are also a great resource, and you can have off-the-record discussions with them. And it's good to build relationships with journalists, and they become more and more important as we see policymaking being less about who you know, which I know in the old days of the EU Brussels bubble, it was all about who do you know in the Commission, what MEP do you have access to. That's still important. That's still valuable. But now it's a much broader landscape of what journalists can you talk to? What kind of creative campaign do you have? Stakeholders that can be your partner in a coalition. Coalitions are building up fast and rapid right now. That's how you're going to get the information flow that you need.
So the latest geopolitical developments seem quite ominous for the global economy. However, in a general sense, do you think that a trade war can be good for lobbyists?
That's a tricky question because a trade war can be good for the ones that wanted it. We will see some lobbyists in the US that wanted this. For the most part, though, it's not good. Businesses don't like uncertainty. Lobbyists have to deal with uncertainty, but it's not very helpful when they're trying to form a strategy that will last for years. I think at this moment in time, what it's doing is making, if we're looking at, say, EU, US, China, even India as well, those dialogues are changing because we're living in a time where globalization is I wouldn't say disappearing, but it's going in a different direction. And after COVID in particular, there's a much bigger focus on localization, the EU turning inwards, US turning inwards. This is something that I think, markets like China and India don't want to see, actually. So what it is forcing people to do is to have more dialogue internally about what's best domestically and reevaluate their relationships with the outside.
So as an American European, do you have a lot of people coming to you and saying, Carmen, what's going on? And if that's happening, how do you respond?
I do. And it's funny that people will think as an American that you can explain why Americans are feeling this way. I think what we've seen over time and we see what we've seen in the US happening over time is a lot of people there are not familiar with the rest of the world and just got tired of whether it's being the world's policeman or sending money outside the US or sending military outside the US. There's many people that don't understand the goals behind that or why previous presidential administrations were doing that. And at the end of the day, it was always because of the US's interest. There's always a US interest behind that. So what you have seen is kind of a rise in a party that sees it can win more votes by addressing the more domestic issues, by talking to people about things closer to home. And I do understand that because people are feeling pain back home, whether it's economically, and they don't see the benefits of what the US is trying to do on a national scale or global scale. I think you see some elements of that here in Europe as well, when we saw some of the far-right movements here as well, maybe for different reasons. And so somebody like Trump, as much as controversial as he is, and the pain he's causing Europe, what he says resonates with people and they really want to believe it. That's something I think over on this side of the ocean that people need to keep in mind and know how to deal with that.
I think one area that many people find difficult to understand and many people in the US probably are not familiar with is EU policy making. And I'd love to hear your tell me about your initial experience of EU policy making and how you saw it, if it was very alien and strange to you. And then as well, if maybe you're coming to see the value of the way that things are done in Brussels.
It was very alien to me when I came. And, my first role here, I started with a trade body called Insurance Europe and represents all the major insurance federations. And that was where I kind of had my baptism by fire. What's a rapporteur? What's a impact assessment, consultation process? What I find interesting, and you look at lobbying here and you look at lobbying in DC. Lobbying in DC tends to be a dirty word. right? It's about money shifting hands, and there's little bit sort of, it's very much who you know, that kind of style. What I appreciate here, at least, is even the smallest voice can get heard. Maybe it's a little bit harder for that small voice to get heard, but it can. It has a chance to participate in the policymaking process. Coalitions being very big here and very effective. I love to work with coalitions because it's really the chance to have a shared vision and a shared message, reinforced by the fact that it's credible coming from a group of stakeholders or an industry. And the fact that you have different member states channeling from their capitals their views into the dialogue here in Brussels. So you have a process that is not only dictated by party politics, but national politics and national interests and cultures and history behind those cultures. So for me, I find that it allows for a much larger breadth of issues to be discussed. And then sometimes in a more academic way, as we see in the Commission, and in the Parliament, of course, that's where you find your voices and your faces and champions for your cause. And then in the Council with the national dynamics. I think that's a very interesting mix. It does tend to make things take longer. And I know there is a lot of complaints about the bureaucracy in Brussels. But it's an interesting mechanism. And I think it's one that really has kept the EU pretty strong after all these years.
Yeah, so one contrast you see now is that in spite of the growth of Ursula von der Leyen's profile, you don't have the same concentration of power in one individual as you seem to have now in the US. Now, what's happening in the US, I'm wondering if you think that there's something systemic wrong with how the political setup works there, or is this a sort of just historical anomaly that we're living through?
I'd like to say it's a historical anomaly. I think Trump is successful because of Trump. We have seen other people try to achieve the same level of success. Nikki Haley tried to do it, Ron DeSantis, both very different personalities. Ted Cruz even, they couldn't do it, even if they tried to use the same rhetoric that he did. There is something about him that people are identifying with. I think even J.D. Vance, who's being poised as the next successor, won't be able to achieve that either. So what's going to be interesting is once he's no longer in the presidency, if or when that happens, let's see. I know he's talking about running for third term and ending elections, but if he's no longer in the presidency, you have to see who you're going to be dealing with next. And it can be a Democrat. We did see Biden win after Trump presidency, so it can go back. But you're not going to see another Biden. I think now we see Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, kind of going around saying they're going to be the next election for the Democrats. It's probably going to be a more leftist administration. And that's not necessarily a good thing for Europe either. So while Europe was caught off guard by the first Trump presidency, I think now you see a little bit more assertiveness, a bit more confidence. After COVID, they realized a bit of a bigger need to become more unified and stronger. I wouldn't say Europe is all the way there, but it's in a state now where it realizes it has to, as I said earlier, evolve with the geopolitics of the world.
Do you not think that this time round Europe was caught off guard by the fact that it seems like the Trump administration wants to end the transatlantic alliance, or has already perhaps ended that alliance?
I don't think it was caught off guard. I think people that had the information they needed and the foresight to see this happening knew. And I think that's exactly why there were many officials concerned when Trump took over the presidency. I know that there's people I've spoken to back in DC that were Republicans and do not support Trump and said prior to the election, if he gets into the presidency, it's going to be very bad. So people knew, and I think people could predict that if he got back in, he was going to surround himself with people that would really reinforce his agenda. And he wasn't as afraid as he was, I think, in the first term to surround himself with traditional Republicans that, know what they're doing. So I think the EU was already anticipating this and bracing themselves for it. But it's hard to brace yourself for something that you have no power to control. They're not able to stop him from imposing tariffs or fracturing the relationship. What they should be mindful is Trump will come here and try to divide the continent. We've already seen him with Meloni in DC. he will try to divide the member states one by one and try to kind of make them turn against each other. If the EU is very invested in remaining unified and sticking together for the sake of the single market, that's a discussion that really needs to be seriously held in the Council.
Okay, very good. Now, coming back to our discussion about, let's say, companies and how to navigate all of this, it seems now that global policy is being dictated by the whims of one, to put it mildly, erratic individual. So, I mean, what can companies actually do to manage this? And what do you say to them?
Well, I think when we're looking at the differences that are growing between the EU and the US right now, there's significantly more opportunities for campaigns and for advocacy. I think we see a lot happening now online. Digital tools are an incredible use to effectuate your campaign and get your message across. And there's something to be said for acting as a bridge here. EU policymakers are navigating DC just as much as DC policymakers are navigating Brussels. There's companies on both sides of the aisles that are concerned. Of course, European companies are concerned about the actions that Trump is taking against Europe. American companies are concerned about the stigma or bias they may face when trying to operate in Europe. Even those that are not supporting Trump's policies, they're getting kind of a reputation for being part of the American system. That's making it harder for them to talk to European policymakers and to have an influence in Europe. In that case, I would say the most important thing that we've seen to European policymakers is what are you contributing to Europe's future? Innovation, sustainability, growth of the European SMEs, which are the backbone of the continent. What are companies doing to help Europe grow and become a bit more autonomous, but really just stronger economically and to deliver on citizens? If a company can show that, then you can get some influence in some meetings with policymakers. This is what's going to be very important during these turbulent times.
So, I mean, APCO has a department, a division, focused on trade. I think, that's extremely important. Do you think that China is now the more reliable partner for Europe? And do you think that your clients should be advocating to, at the very least, keep that Chinese market open, if not try to deepen the links with China?
China is in an interesting position right now, and I think Chinese officials know that. I think Beijing knows that. There are opportunities in Europe for collaborations, and that's something the EU is seeing. There's a dialogue there ongoing with Beijing. Obviously, there's still very deep concerns about IP protection or the subsidies issues that has come up. But what's important is Europe wants to make sure that it remains open for business. It's a global market, and a global market means you act globally. The best way that they can do this is continuing to have that dialogue with Beijing, both with DC, and there needs to be some consistency in the way that they are talking about the market. If they want to be the leader for multilateralism, for trade, then really set that example by continuing to be constructive and continuing to have that dialogue with all partners.
But in a very general sense, don't you think that Europe is going to be forced to make a choice?
I don't think so. I think we will see, as hard as it is to imagine, I think we will see a reset of EU-US relations because these two partners are historically just too important. Trump is a temporary thing. It might be a very lengthy, years-long temporary administration, but it will be temporary. And there will be some reset of relations here because the interests in each other's markets are just too strong. You can't have two of the biggest markets in the world not trading with each other or not cooperating with each other in some form. What will be different is the relationship, and the trust between those markets will change. But that's not a bad thing. It will mean probably less reliance by the EU on the US, perhaps the US less interference in European matters. So that will change, but I do believe that the two partners will come back together again.
Okay, very good. Coming back to your experiences in DC versus your experience in Brussels. So you mentioned lobbying being a dirty word in the US, but do you think there are things that Brussels-based lobbyists can learn from DC lobbyists?
What could Brussels-based? I think there's some things that DC-based lobbyists can learn from Brussels, but maybe what I would say, DC lobbyists tend to be very very strong, right? Very aggressive. I think sometimes here what I'm seeing, and this happens particular in trade associations and coalitions, the message could be a little bit watery, sometimes a little bit too damped down.
So general that nobody notices.
Yeah. So general. You have a lot of these letters that are very general. What you see in the U.S. is really strong language, very often used. But the U.S. is also a bit more of a sensationalist player, right? In D.C., everything that gets changed is media. And this is what I mentioned earlier. We do start to see that in Europe, but it's happening later, right, than it has in the U.S. And I think in Europe, now it used to be just Politico in Brussels. Now we've got a number of other outlets. We've got, podcasts as well, such as yourself. We've got online influencers and channels and thought leaders. Over the course of my time here, I've seen that really, really grow quite a lot. And now you're going to start seeing it in the capitals as well. So this is what digitalization and online channels have given us, kind of this escalation of the use of media and its influence on policymaking. And this is why when developing any campaign, the audience is not just policymakers, it's also your journalists, your influencers, your thought leaders, and how you're going to tackle all of those together.
Okay, very good. You've mentioned coalitions a couple of times. Let's say somebody is in the process of trying to put a coalition together. What advice would you give them?
I would say there's really 3 key things to look at. First of all, influence, trust, and impact. What do I mean by influence? To make sure that the coalition is purpose-driven, that it's led by the members, not just one, but, jointly led. It's a hub of information. You have a clear face, a clear spokesperson that people can relate to, and you're able to pump out thought leadership that illustrates what your coalition stands for. And if you have trust, building trust with policymakers, build the case for your objectives, for investment in your sector, or if it's proportionate legislation, be clear so that people can trust in what you're saying. And ultimately, impact. You can't just sit around doing position papers. You've got to have some sort of events, a constructive online social media strategy, a network with media. I've done that with coalitions before. You can have background briefings with journalists that will filter into their articles. This is important to get the message out there and build the reputation and credibility behind what you're saying. So these 3 elements are really a great way to make sure that you can amplify your voice in any coalition.
So you've achieved a tremendous amount in your career so far, going from being an attorney to lobbying, to trade associations, to running this office in Brussels. What else would you like to achieve in your career?
Oh, gosh.
Because there's still so much to go, right, Carmen?
Yeah, there is. I always say that everyone is always still learning. I always try to tell people, the best way to grow is to get uncomfortable. I think it's good to be a little uncomfortable every day, to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because that's where you learn. And that's when you know that you're changing. I'll say coming over here, it was tough. I had to learn an entirely new system. I had to learn that governments were not always a 2-party system, that you had coalitions and that governments, and that you had all these different parties, not just different parties in the Brussels bubble, but different national politics as well. It's incredibly challenging. I will say in that respect, it's very different from DC. But for our next step, I think I would really like to remain an impactful leader at APCO, but also someone that can help companies not only understand Brussels, but how Brussels and the EU works with the world. I'm really fascinated by this and would love to continue working with organizations and businesses on this issue.
What I'm picking up from your answers throughout this whole discussion is that you seem to have a great affection for Europe and maybe the European way of doing politics, maybe the European way of life. Do you think that you've grown to love the experience here?
I have actually, and I think that's what makes Brussels so unique. Is it's really an international city. You're working, we have a very international, multilingual team here. I have Belgo-American kids. They were born and grew up in Belgium, but they know the U.S. very well. We travel there. They're exposed to it. And I think it's interesting talking to them about what's happening between the two today, because they feel close to both nationalities. And I just try to tell them, look, sometimes, siblings disagree. In this case, the siblings are the EU and the US. But like any siblings do, they try to find a way to come back together. So
I need this optimism. I need this sort of positive view on the situation. I mean, I have to say I'm more pessimistic about the whole thing, but this is very welcome.
Yeah, I think that's what we need to have some patience. You know, a lot of what happens in the US is just kind of noise. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of noise in Brussels too. And if people can sift through that noise and just, if you're talking about someone that needs to influence or shape something, stay true to your message. I would say be visible, visible. Make sure that there's a face behind your message, and just make sure to maintain some credibility with it, and you'll get somewhere.
I haven't heard any indication at all that you're interested in going back to DC. However, I sort of think that maybe DC needs somebody like you. You could go back and evangelize for the European way of doing things, right?
That's nice to say, but I worry it will be a very different DC by the time I go back, if I go back. But yeah, it's, I think what we'll see in DC in the future is, it might be very divided. We do see some new faces coming up. I mean, Pete Buttigieg is someone that I think is a great new player in the Democrat Party. And I think that we'll see some people with reasonable views. And at some point, the American people will get exhausted. And they're going to be looking for that adult in the room again.
Okay, so we'll just hold tight until then.
I think we have to. I don't know, Paul, if you have any choice.
Carmen Bell, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.